I want you to just, for a second, picture the map of the Middle East in your head. Close your eyes if you have to.
Yeah.
It's Friday, February 6th, 2026. And if you look at the satellite imagery or, even just the movement of steel in the ocean, you are seeing, well, you're seeing arguably the largest concentration of firepower the region has seen since the Second World War.
It's staggering. We're talking about multiple U.S. Navy carrier strike groups, not just one. They're positioned in the Arabian Sea, just outside the Gulf.
And it's not just the sea. We're talking about missile silos being primed from the Zagros Mountains in Iran to bases in the Negev. It just feels like the air itself is filled with gasoline, and, well, everyone is holding a lit match.
It is the absolute definition of a powder keg. If you were an alien looking down from orbit, you'd assume the war had already started, or was literally minutes away from starting. You would see all the pieces in place for a massive, devastating conflict.
And this is the part that honestly just makes my head spin. If you zoom in on a very specific, very quiet, air-conditioned building in Muscat, Oman, right now, today.
There's no shouting.
No shouting, no explosions. You probably just hear the hum of the AC, maybe the clinking of tea glasses and, low murmurs. Negotiations have resumed.
That is the central paradox of February 2026. We are simultaneously walking on a knife's edge between a catastrophic regional war and maybe a breakthrough diplomatic deal.
And both things are happening at the exact same time. It feels impossible.
It feels completely contradictory.
Usually history teaches us it's one or the other, right? You're either fighting or you're talking. But the stack of reports we're diving into today, and look, we have a massive stack from the analyst group Barakface, covering everything from Pentagon planning docs to street-level sentiment in Tehran. It suggests we've entered a new era. They have a name for it.
They do. They call it diplomacy warfare.
It's a jarring term, isn't it? Diplomacy warfare.
It really is. It sounds like something out of a corporate strategy meeting, a contradiction in terms.
It sounds like corporate buzzword bingo, to be totally honest. Is this actually a real strategic doctrine, or is it just a fancy way of saying aggressive talking?
It does sound like a buzzword, doesn't it? But if you look at the texture of what's actually happening on the ground, it starts to make a weird kind of sense.
Okay, so break it down.
Well, think about it like this. Usually, diplomacy is what you do to avoid using your military. It's the alternative to war.
Right. Talk instead of shoot.
Exactly. But here, the military itself is being used as a diplomatic tool. It's part of the conversation. The military movements are the punctuation marks in the negotiation.
So the aircraft carriers aren't actually there to launch planes?
Well, not necessarily. They are there to be seen being able to launch planes. They're there to make the threat of launching planes so real, so palpable, that it changes the math for the person sitting across from you at the table in Oman.
It's communicative violence.
That's a great way to put it. You move a carrier group not to bomb Tehran, but to change the calculus of Foreign Minister Iraqi. You're using kinetic assets, real ships, real planes, real soldiers, to achieve non-kinetic outcomes. That is a very specific, and I have to say, a very, very dangerous type of warfare.
It's high-stakes poker, but instead of using plastic chips, you're betting with ballistic missiles and the entire global oil supply.
And the risk, of course, is that poker games sometimes end with someone getting angry and flipping the table. The analysis we have points this out very clearly. The risks here aren't just about intent. It's possible that no one, not in Washington, not in Tehran, actually wants a war.
But wanting it doesn't matter.
It doesn't. The real risks are miscommunication, miscalculation, or, and this is a big one, a proxy force going rogue. The Houthis in Yemen, Hezbollah in Lebanon, one of them makes a move that wasn't authorized, and the whole thing spirals.
A single cyber attack hitting the wrong electrical grid, or a drone intercept over the Gulf that goes wrong.
Exactly. One errant action. That's all it would take right now, today, to ignite the whole region. So the mission of this deep dive isn't just to look at the U.S. and Iran in a vacuum. We need to understand the mechanics of how you stop an explosion that has, in many ways, already started.
So we're going to look at the standoff itself.
We have to.
Yeah.
Then the really fascinating role of the Iranian diaspora, which is an overlooked X factor. And then this rising group of what the sources call middle power mediators, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, and Oman, who are basically trying to save themselves, and in doing so, maybe save the world from a massive crisis.
All right, let's start there. Part one, the standoff. We've defined diplomacy warfare, but let's get granular. Let's go inside that room in Oman. What does this actually look like? Because it seems like the fight isn't even about the details of a deal yet.
Oh, not at all.
It's about what they're even allowed to talk about.
You're absolutely right. The front line isn't a trench in the desert. It's the agenda. The piece of paper that says, here's what we're discussing today, that is where the war is being fought right now. It's the agenda battle.
Okay, so who is demanding what? Let's start with the Iranian side.
All right. On the Iranian side, you have the administration of President Masoud Pezeshkian, who is seen as a relative moderate, and his very experienced foreign minister, Abbas Araki. They have a very clear, very disciplined strategy. Narrow the scope.
Shrink the table.
Shrink the table, shrink the conversation. Keep it as focused as possible.
What's the logic there? Why do they want it so narrow?
Because a narrow scope is containable. A narrow scope is transactional. They want to talk about two things, and two things only. Sanctions relief and nuclear constraints. That's it.
So it's a simple trade.
They want it to be. We slow down our uranium enrichment, you unfreeze our assets, and let us sell our oil again. The business deal. And that's why they prefer bilateral talks, ideally just with the U.S., kept very quiet in a place like Oman, away from the big multilateral venues like Turkey or Vienna, where other powers could get involved.
Okay, so Iran wants to buy a car. A simple, straightforward transaction. What is the U.S. saying?
The U.S., represented on the ground by Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, and we're hearing a lot of chatter that Jared Kushner is involved in the background, shaping the broader strategy.
Okay.
The U.S. is saying no, a hard no. They are insisting on what they call a broader dialogue.
Which is code for?
Linkage. It's a classic and often very effective diplomatic trap. The U.S. is refusing to talk about the nuclear issue in isolation. They are saying they will not discuss sanctions relief unless Iran is also willing to put three other things on the table.
And those are?
1, the missile program, specifically the ballistic missile threat to U.S. allies and bases in the region. 2, the regional proxies. That means the militias across the Middle East, in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen. And 3, human rights, the domestic oppression inside Iran.
I see. So to use that car analogy, Iran just wants to come in and buy the call.
Yeah.
And the U.S. is the dealer saying, we can't sell you this car unless you also agree to quit smoking, join a gym, stop yelling at your neighbors, and completely change your entire lifestyle.
That is a perfect analogy. And for Iran, that list of demands is impossible. Quitting smoking, which is their metaphor for giving up their proxy militias, is existential for them. They view those militias not as a bad habit, but as their forward defense. It's their insurance policy against invasion.
It's their strategic depth.
Precisely. So, by insisting on discussing proxies, the U.S. is essentially asking Iran to disarm before they've even signed a deal. And that's a non-starter for Tehran, which is why the fight over what to talk about is actually more intense and more violent in its own way than the talks themselves.
It's a fundamental clash of worldviews being fought over a meeting agenda. But why is the U.S. pushing this so hard now? Why not just take the win on the nuclear file and run?
Leverage. The answer is leverage. Look at the date.
Yeah.
February 2026. The sources are very clear on this point. The U.S. has completed its military positioning. The carriers are in place. The bombers are on standby. Adding more ships, the analysis says, has diminishing returns.
You can only look so threatening.
You're maxed out on the threat display. So now, the pressure shifts from the kinetic to the non-kinetic. You pivot to the economic levers.
And the sources mention a pretty severe currency crisis happening in Tehran right now.
Severe is an understatement. The rial is in an absolute free fall. We're talking about a situation where people's salaries, their life savings, are being wiped out in a matter of weeks. It's causing massive internal unrest, strikes, protests. The Iranian government needs a deal to avert a total economic collapse. They are on a clock.
And the U.S. knows this.
Of course. It's the core of their strategy. The U.S. calculates that they can afford to drag these negotiations out over weeks, maybe even months. They can sit in Oman, drink coffee, and let Iran's economy continue to burn. That gives them the leverage to say, if you want the cash, you have to talk about the missiles. You have to talk about the human rights. It's a war of attrition fought with exchange rates instead of bullets.
Speaking of human rights, that brings us to what the source material calls the X factor. And I have to say, this is the part of the analysis that surprised me the most. We spend so much time talking about governments, armies, spies.
The hard power stuff.
Exactly. We rarely talk about the diaspora.
It's a massive blind spot in most geopolitical analysis. It's treated as a footnote. But in this particular conflict with this particular country, the Iranian diaspora is a major strategic player. It's a piece on the chessboard.
And just for scale, we're talking about a lot of people here. The sources say over 5 million globally.
Easily, maybe more. The main concentrations are in the U.S., especially Southern California, Europe, particularly Germany, Sweden, and the U.K., and of course Canada. And you have to remember, these aren't just one homogenous group. These are waves of migration that go all the way back to the 1979 revolution.
Right.
Then you have another wave after the 2009 Green Movement was crushed, and another more recent wave of people who fled after the 2022 protests. Each wave brings its own politics, its own trauma, its own vision for Iran.
The sources use this interesting term, migratory diplomacy. Break that down for me. Is that just, people tweeting their opinions from Los Angeles, or is it something more tangible?
It's much, much more organized than that.
Okay.
I think it's helpful to think of it as a spectrum of influence. On one end of that spectrum, you have what you could call cultural diplomacy. This is the work of organizations like the Farhang Foundation in the U.S. Their job is essentially to act as ambassadors for Iranian culture without the government portfolio. They're doing the patient work of showing the West that Iranian doesn't just mean mullah or nuclear program.
It means art, history, poetry, science, music.
Exactly. It's about separating the people from the regime in the public imagination of the West. Building soft power, building trust, countering stereotypes. It's a long-term project.
But then you move down the spectrum.
And you move down the spectrum to hard-nosed politics. This is the migratory diplomacy part. Second-generation Iranians, the children of those who fled in '79 or later, are now fully integrated into Western political systems. They are staffers on Capitol Hill. They are advisors in the State Department. They're running influential think tanks in London and D.C. They are in a position to influence bilateral ties from the inside.
And they're bringing the legacy, the fire of the woman life freedom movement with them.
That shadow is huge. You cannot understand the diaspora's role in 2026 without understanding what happened in 2022. The movement sparked by Mahsa Amini's death was a sea change. It mobilized and, to some extent, unified the diaspora in a way we had never seen before.
I mean, the sources mention a rally in Berlin, 80,000 people.
80,000 people. That's a stadium full of people. That's not a fringe group. That is a major political force. And they are lobbying for very specific, very hardline policies.
Like designating the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, as a terrorist organization.
Which is a major sticking point in any negotiation. They're also fighting a sophisticated information war. When the regime in Tehran shuts down the internet to crush a protest, the diaspora becomes the world's window. They're the ones with the satellite links, the secure comms. They amplify the videos. They translate the slogans. They make it impossible for the world to just look away and pretend it's not happening.
But, and here's where it's really, really complicated, the sources are very emphatic that this group is not a monolith. They aren't all singing from the same hymn sheet.
No, not even close. It's not a monolith. And frankly, our sources describe it as something of a civil war within the diaspora itself.
I think a lot of people in the West have a simplistic view. They assume the diaspora just means everyone who hates the regime. But the reality described in these reports is so much messier.
It's incredibly fractured. Think of it less like a unified opposition and more like a very dysfunctional family dinner where no one is speaking to each other, or worse, they're actively throwing plates.
So who are the main factions at this dinner table?
Well, on one end, you have the monarchists. These are the people who are often waving the pre-1979 flag, the Shiro Khorshid, the lion and sun.
The Make Iran Great Again crowd, in a sense.
You could see it that way. They want to see a return of the Pahlavi dynasty, or at least a return to that form of secular nationalism. In terms of policy, they generally support maximum pressure, they want tougher sanctions, and many are not opposed to military intervention if they think it will lead to regime change. They often align closely with hawkish lobbies in the West and in Israel.
So that's the burn it down to build it back approach.
Yeah, that's one perspective, yes. But then, sitting right next to them, or more likely shouting at them from across the street at a protest, you have the reformists and the anti-sanctions groups.
And their argument is what?
Their argument is that the U.S. sanctions are a form of collective punishment. They say these sanctions are starving their grandmothers back in Isfahan, not the high-ranking officials of the regime. They believe the sanctions actually strengthen the regime's grip by making the population dependent on the state for rations.
They want change, but they're terrified of what an intervention would look like.
They are terrified of an Iraq-style intervention or, even worse, a Syria-style civil war that would completely destroy the country. So they advocate for diplomacy, for lifting sanctions, for empowering civil society from within.
So when you see that crowd of 80,000 people marching in Berlin, they might all be marching against the regime.
But they are fighting each other tooth and nail about what should come next. The sources mention reports of actual fistfights breaking out at protests over which flag to wave. the monarchist flag or the plain tricolor flag. And of course, the regime in Tehran loves this. They actively sow disinformation to exploit these divisions and paint the entire diaspora as a chaotic, feuding mess.
Despite all that infighting, though, it seems like they have a seat at the table in 2026. The sources specifically mention Jared Kushner is actually assembling a team.
Yes, and this is a fascinating development and a sign of how seriously the U.S. is taking the diaspora's potential role. The reports we have suggest Kushner is gathering a group of prominent Iranian-American business leaders, tech entrepreneurs, and influencers to advise on what the documents call transition scenarios.
Transition scenarios. That is a very polite, very diplomatic way of saying what happens if the regime collapses.
It certainly implies preparing for a power vacuum, yes, but even short of a full collapse, this group provides the U.S. with the human rights lever we talked about earlier. They humanize the abstract political debate. When a U.S. diplomat brings up human rights, Tehran can dismiss it as Western propaganda. But when you have a diaspora member at the table or testifying before Congress sharing personal, visceral testimonies of oppression about a family member executed, a sibling imprisoned, it becomes much, much harder for the international community to just talk about centrifuges and enrichment percentages. It forces the human cost of the regime onto the agenda.
So you have the military pressure from the carrier groups, the economic pressure from the currency crisis, and now this people pressure from the diaspora. It's a multi-front campaign.
It is. But let's shift gears to the guys who are trying to stop the whole thing from blowing up. The mediators.
Middle powers.
Yes. The neighborhood firefighters.
We have 4 key players here that the sources focus on: Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, and Oman. And what's interesting is how the sources treat them almost like character archetypes in a movie. They each have a very distinct style, a different way of operating.
Very different.
Let's start with the heavyweight, the biggest player in the room, Saudi Arabia.
The CEO of the region.
Right. And Saudi Arabia has changed so dramatically in the last decade. We hear so much about Vision 2030, the futuristic cities like Neom, the massive investment in sports, tourism. But how does that flashy, futuristic PR campaign connect to stopping a war with Iran?
It's not just PR, it's the new operating system of the entire country. The logic under Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman is actually very simple and very rational. You cannot have Vision 2030 in a war zone. It's impossible.
It's bad for business.
It's catastrophic for business. You can't build Neom, this trillion-dollar city of the future. You can't fill the Red Sea resorts with Western tourists. You can't host the World Cup if missiles are flying over the Persian Gulf and oil tankers are on fire. The two realities cannot coexist.
So peace becomes a core business requirement.
Exactly. The sources call it strategic de-risking. The kingdom has made a calculated decision that to achieve its massive economic diversification goals, it needs regional stability above all else. So they've shifted from a policy of confrontation with Iran to one of conciliation.
We saw the biggest sign of that with the 2023 pivot, right? When China surprised everyone by brokering that deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran.
That was the absolute turning point. Now, let's be clear. Reopening embassies didn't magically solve all their problems. They still don't trust each other. The competition is still fierce. But it established a hotline. It created a channel for direct communication. It stopped the direct bleeding between the two regional giants.
And the sources say that ending the Qatar blockade in 2021 was a precursor to that.
A vital one. It was the first sign that the GCC countries were realizing they were stronger together. It was the beginning of this new era of unity for the sake of profit, you could say. They buried the hatchet because they realized fighting amongst themselves while the region burned was a losing strategy for everyone.
But what's interesting is they aren't just focused on protecting themselves. The sources show them mediating files that have nothing to do with them directly.
They want to be the indispensable nation in the region. Look at their moves on Israel-Palestine. In October 2024, they launched this thing called the Global Alliance for the Implementation of the Two-State Solution.
That's a mouthful.
It is, but the name is less important than the action. They are drawing a very clear line in the sand. There will be no normalization of relations with Israel, no big diplomatic prize for Tel Aviv, without tangible progress toward Palestinian statehood. By doing that, they are positioning themselves as the leader of both the Arab and the wider Islamic world on this issue.
And then there's Ukraine, a conflict thousands of miles away.
Right. They hosted the Jeddah Summit in August 2023, trying to find a path to peace. They've been facilitating prisoner exchanges involving Russia. They're hosting the peace talks for the civil war in Sudan. They are actively practicing what the sources call desert diplomacy, using their wealth and their central location to become the region's primary conflict resolution hub.
It really feels like they're trying to consciously outgrow the oil state label and become a statesman state.
And the sources point out something critical about their long-term strategy. Saudi Arabia is already positioning itself to be the key financial player in post-conflict reconstruction in places like Gaza, Lebanon, and Syria. They know that whoever pays to rebuild the region gets to shape the future of the region. They are playing the very, very long game.
Okay, so from the CEO, let's move to the global bridge builder. Let's talk about the UAE.
The UAE is the fixer. If Saudi Arabia is the CEO setting the grand strategy, the UAE is the COO focused on execution. Their style is what the sources label niche diplomacy.
What does that mean in practice?
It means discreet, results-oriented, and often happening behind closed doors. They don't make a lot of grand announcements, they just get things done. Their philosophy is one of positive mediation. They see themselves as building bridges, not just between enemies, but between the global north and the global south.
And when it comes to results, the numbers on the prisoner swaps you mentioned earlier are just staggering.
They are the undisputed gold standard of mediation right now, particularly on the Russia-Ukraine file. Just in this month, February 2026, they managed a swath of 314 captives, 157 on each side.
And the total over the course of the war.
As of the latest reports, we have 4,955 prisoners. Almost 5,000 people have been returned to their families because of Emirati mediation.
I want to just pause on that for a moment. Think about the logistics of that. How do you move 157 prisoners of war across an active front line?
It's incredibly complex. You need a neutral airport. You need trusted planes that won't be shot down. You need security guarantees from both Moscow and Kyiv that the transport will be safe. You need teams on the ground to handle the logistics. The UAE provides that reliable, trusted infrastructure. They have painstakingly built enough trust with both Vladimir Putin and Volodymyr Zelensky that both sides will actually answer the phone when they call.
And they've done this while maintaining this very tricky, very delicate balance in their foreign policy.
Incredibly tricky. But let's bring it back to their role in the current Iran crisis, because the UAE has a very specific, very visceral anxiety that perhaps even Saudi Arabia doesn't feel quite as acutely.
Missiles.
Missiles.
We keep hearing about Iran's ballistic missiles, but let's just ground this for the listener. Geographically, when we talk about the Persian Gulf, we are talking about a very small pond.
It's a bathtub. The Persian Gulf is tiny. And you have to understand, if Iran fires a ballistic missile from its coast at Abu Dhabi or Dubai, we are not talking about the kind of warning time you see in the movies. You don't get 20 or 30 minutes to scramble jets and sound the sirens.
We're talking minutes.
Less. Depending on the trajectory and the type of missile, you're potentially talking about less than 5 minutes from launch to impact. You cannot reliably intercept that. And the UAE is a country of gleaming glass skyscrapers, massive international airports, and a tourism-based economy. One missile landing in downtown Dubai ends their entire economic model overnight.
It's the ultimate glasshouse problem. You can't throw stones, and you really can't afford to have them thrown at you.
Exactly. So when the sources say the UAE has anxiety, that is a massive understatement. They are living inside the bullseye of a loaded gun. And that's why you see their senior diplomatic advisor, Anwar Gargash, come out on February 3rd with that very pointed statement, saying the Middle East does not need another confrontation. They're desperately pushing for direct U.S.-Iran dialogue because they know that if shooting starts, they are the first collateral damage.
Okay, next mediator. The one the sources rather dramatically call the high-stakes mediator. Let's talk about Qatar.
Qatar. If Saudi is the CEO and the UAE is the fixer, Qatar is the maverick, the risk taker.
Their strategy seems to be talk to everyone, especially the people you aren't supposed to talk to.
That's it exactly. Their brand is being any port in a storm. They actively engage with everyone. They have a massive U.S. airbase, Al Udeid, on their soil. But they also maintain open channels with Hamas, the Taliban, and crucially, with Iran. They make a point of talking to the pariahs.
And that gets them in a lot of trouble.
Constantly. They have faced relentless scrutiny for it. Hosting the political leadership of Hamas in Doha led to real economic consequences, like dips in foreign direct investment in 2023. They've been heavily criticized by members of the U.S. Congress. But what's remarkable is their resilience.
Right. The sources mentioned they've been physically hit.
This is a key point. In 2025, there was an Iranian missile strike on the Al Udeid Air Base, which hosts thousands of American troops. And there were also Israeli strikes on Doha targeting Hamas figures.
Wait, so they took fire from both sides of a conflict.
They took fire, and yet they kept mediating. They didn't shut down the channels. That shows a level of commitment to their role, or perhaps a level of necessity, given their size and location, that is very hard to overstate.
What's their biggest and most important file right now?
Gaza and Hamas, without a doubt. They have been the central nervous system of every single one of those ceasefire talks since October 2023. They secured the release of over 100 hostages in the early stages of that conflict. They were instrumental in brokering a full ceasefire in January of 2025. They even played a key role in former President Trump's 20-point peace plan in October 2025.
And let's not forget the money. The big U.S.-Iran prisoner swap back in 2023.
The $6 billion in unfrozen Iranian funds, that was Qatar. They are the bankers of the gray zone. They act as the escrow account. They hold the money when no one trusts anyone else to hold it.
It's a very high-risk, high-reward strategy, but it seems to make them indispensable. If you, as a Western power, need to talk to the bad guys, you often have to go through Doha.
That's their entire value proposition. They are the necessary bridge to the unreachable.
All right, finally, let's move to the host of our current drama, the quiet one in the corner, Oman.
The quiet facilitator, or, as they have been called for decades, the Switzerland of the Middle East.
Why do they get that title? Is it just because they try to stay neutral in conflicts?
It goes much deeper than just policy. It's rooted in their national identity and their religious tradition.
Yeah.
Oman is a majority Ibadi Muslim country.
Which is distinct from the Sunni tradition of Saudi Arabia and the Shia tradition of Iran.
Very distinct and distinctively moderate. The Ibadi school of Islam has a long tradition of fostering a kind of theological neutrality. They just don't get dragged into the sectarian dogfights between Riyadh and Tehran. It's not part of their DNA. So they managed to stay out of the Camp A versus Camp B dynamics that trap so many other countries in the region.
And their style of diplomacy is very analog, very old school.
It is. The sources describe it as leak-proof mediation. It's low profile but high trust. When you go to Muscat for a secret talk, you know the details are not going to appear in the Washington Post the next morning. That culture of discretion is why the current, extremely sensitive U.S.-Iran talks on February 6, 2026 are happening there.
They are the ultimate safe house.
They are. And they prepare the ground for this moment. The sources tell us that back in January 2026, the Omani foreign minister, Badir bin Hamad al-Busaidi, took a special trip to Tehran. The specific purpose was to facilitate message exchanges amid all the threatening rhetoric coming from the incoming Trump administration in the U.S. They were pre-wiring the building before the crisis fully peaked.
And they have a long history of this too, right? They laid the groundwork for that big Saudi-Iran deal, even if China ended up getting the big photo op at the end.
They did all the early quiet work on that for years, and they brokered the truce between the U.S. and the Houthis in Yemen in 2025. And what's really interesting and speaks to their strategy is that they continue to refuse to normalize relations with Israel.
Why is that, when it seems like everyone else in the Gulf is at least thinking about it?
Because it's essential for preserving their credibility as a mediator. If they normalize, they lose their standing as a truly unbiased broker in the eyes of actors like Iran or Hezbollah or the Houthis. They need to stay distinct to remain effective. If everyone joins the same club, who is left to talk to the people who are standing outside the clubhouse?
That's a really important point. You always need someone standing in the doorway.
Exactly. Oman is the perpetual doorway.
So to recap where we are, we've got the standoff with its agenda battle. We've got the diaspora engaged in its own internal civil war. We've got this fascinating cast of mediators, each with their own style. But here we are, February 6, 2026, and the deadlock remains. Iran wants to talk nukes. The U.S. wants to talk about everything.
It's stuck.
So part 7 of our deep dive suggests there might be a way out, a structural change to the negotiations themselves.
Right. Sources call it multi-stakeholder diplomacy.
Break that down. Is that just fancy consultant speak for more meetings?
It's a bit more strategic than that. The core idea is that it's a solution to the fundamental failure of bilateralism. The two-party talks, just the U.S. versus Iran, are stuck in a dead end. They are just shouting their talking points past each other. So the proposed solution is make the table bigger.
Don't shrink the table, expand it.
Exactly. Bring in the other affected parties to break the deadlock and change the chemistry of the room.
You create coalitions within the negotiation.
Right. And the sources propose 2 main coalitions. First, you create the missile coalition.
Who is in that group?
The UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar. You bring them into the room for the sessions, specifically dealing with Iran's missile program.
Why does that change the dynamic? What's the strategic value of having them there?
Because right now when the U.S. negotiator says, we need to talk about your ballistic missiles, the Iranian negotiator hears, the great Satan wants to disarm us so they can invade us. It's an ideological historical argument.
It's abstract.
It's abstract. But if the Emirati envoy is sitting right there at the table and says, look, boss, we want to invest $10 billion in your tourism sector, but we can't get our insurance companies to sign off on building hotels in a country that has missiles pointed at our airports, it completely changes the conversation.
It validates the U.S. concern, but from a neighborly perspective. It stops being about imperialist overreach and starts becoming a neighborhood zoning dispute.
That's the perfect way to put it. It makes the missile threat real and tangible rather than just a U.S. talking point. And, critically, it offers a massive incentive. If Iran agrees to constraints on its missile program, they don't just get sanctions relief from the U.S., they get the promise of massive economic integration with the wealthiest economies in their own region. It's a huge, huge carrot.
Okay, so that's the Missile Coalition. Then you have the Human Rights Coalition.
This is where you bring the voice of the diaspora into the process.
Now, how does that work in practice? You can't exactly invite 5 million people into the negotiating room in Oman.
No, of course not. But you integrate their designated representatives, or you make their specific concerns and testimonies a formal part of the agenda. As we discussed, there's a push from figures like Senator Marco Rubio for this. The logic is the same as with the Missile Coalition.
Right.
If the U.S. brings up Iran's treatment of women or political prisoners, Iran dismisses it as cultural imperialism or foreign interference. But if the people raising these issues are themselves Iranian, it completely counters that narrative. It becomes about Iranians asking for fundamental rights for other Iranians. It's a much harder argument for the regime to deflect.
And then there's what the sources call the Kushner-Witkoff angle. How does that fit in?
This seems to be about tying all these threads together. The idea is to utilize the existing network of the Abraham Accords, the diplomatic and economic ties between Israel, the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, and combine it with the financial power of the diaspora business community.
To create a squeeze and relieve strategy.
Exactly. You pressure Tehran with the political and economic unity of the region, showing them they are isolated, but at the same time you offer them a very real, very tangible economic off-ramp that is backed by actual private capital from these communities, not just vague government promises that might disappear with the next election.
It's a fascinating, comprehensive strategy, a genuinely new way of looking at diplomacy. But let's zoom out for our final section, part 8. Let's look at the global stakes. Why is the rest of the world watching this standoff so closely? I mean, obviously war is bad, but is there something more specific that's keeping leaders in Tokyo and Berlin and Beijing awake at night?
One word: energy. It always, always, always comes back to energy.
Still, even in 2026, I feel like we're constantly told we're in a green transition. We're all driving EVs and using solar panels now.
We are transitioning, yes, but that transition is slow and far from complete. The hard reality is that the global economy is still perilously reliant on the steady flow of Middle Eastern oil and gas.
Right.
And the choke point for a huge percentage of that flow is the Strait of Hormuz. It is still the jugular vein of the world's energy supply.
So if a single missile flies in the Gulf,
Any disruption, whether it's deliberate sabotage of a tanker, an accidental strike, or a full closure of the strait by Iran, it triggers an instant and devastating global chain reaction.
trace that reaction for us.
Okay, the strait closes. Oil tankers have to reroute, adding weeks and millions of dollars to their journeys. Shipping insurance rates for the entire region skyrocket to unimaginable levels. The price per barrel of oil jumps not by a few dollars, but maybe by 30, 40, 50% overnight.
And that means
That means the price of gasoline in California and Germany and South Korea soars. But it's not just gas. The cost of shipping everything from iPhones to bananas goes up because fuel costs go up. So you get a massive, immediate spike in global inflation. Supply chains, which are already fragile, collapse. Energy shocks hit Europe and especially Asia. China, Japan, India, they're all hugely dependent on that oil.
so a war in the Persian Gulf isn't just a regional tragedy, it's a guaranteed global recession.
Or depression, a deep one. And that is why everyone is involved. That's why the American carriers are there. But it's also why Chinese and European diplomats are working the phones frantically behind the scenes. It's why everyone is putting pressure on the negotiators drinking coffee in Oman.
It brings us right back to that paradox we started with, this impossible, tense balance.
The paradox of 2026. Because what the sources make clear is that true triumph, true victory in this scenario isn't winning a war. It isn't about planting a flag on a hill or a decisive military victory.
Right.
True triumph is sustaining dialogue amid the din of saber rattling. It's just keeping the talk going while the guns are loaded and everyone's fingers on the trigger. It's boring, it's frustrating, it's agonizingly slow. But in February 2026, it is the only win available on the board.
So let's try to wrap all of this up. We are sitting in this precarious space between war and peace. We've seen warfare itself evolve from the battlefield into this new arena of diplomacy warfare, where missiles and aircraft carriers are being used as negotiating leverage.
The ultimate bargaining chits.
And the power players in this new game aren't just the old superpowers, the US and Iran. It's this complex ecosystem. The new middle power mediators, the CEO, Saudi Arabia, the fixer, the UAE, the maverick, Qatar, and the quiet introvert, Oman. And alongside them, this powerful but deeply divided Iranian diaspora.
That's the new board. It's a multipolar world playing out in a single crisis.
Now, as we finish, I want to leave you, our listener, with a final provocative thought. It's something that jumped out at me from a line in the sources that kind of gave me chills. We mentioned earlier that Saudi Arabia and the UAE are already looking at post-conflict reconstruction.
Yes, drawing up big plans for how to rebuild Gaza, Lebanon, Syria, once the dust settles.
So here's the question. Does that imply that while they are actively mediating for peace, they are also heavily preparing for, or perhaps even accepting as inevitable, the aftermath of major destruction?
It raises a profound and disturbing question, doesn't it? Do they view this current turmoil not just as a crisis to be solved, but as a necessary birthing pain? Are they looking at the current destruction and thinking, this is the fire that clears the dead wood from the forest?
Are they preparing to build a completely new Middle Eastern order on the rubble of the old one, an order that they, with their capital and their vision, will get to design?
It suggests they might be playing a game that is much, much bigger than just preventing war this week. They might be planning the political and economic architecture of the region for the next century.
A very sobering thought to end on. Watch the news coming out of Oman closely in the coming days. The future might be decided in those quiet, air-conditioned meeting rooms, or it might be decided by a single mistake in the Persian Gulf. Thanks for listening to this deep dive.
Thank you.